Today we're going to be talking about guardrails for LLMs, and then we'll bring Rohit up to the stage. So in the slides, you show that initially people are kind of creating these guardrails in the application layer, like they're creating it for their specific applications. And now, I guess like what's the philosophical approach behind taking the
Yeah,
guardrail and putting it into the AI gateway? Is there like a way that
right.
we can like easily kind of abstract this into like the same idea that we take towards like API gateways?
Yeah. So it's exactly the same, right? And you put it very well, which is instead of just doing everything within your application, you can just abstract this out into a layer of its own. So the AI gateway is like a specialized API gateway in a way, and you can actually run these as content policy checks. So, API gateways have these content policy checks. Guardrails are nothing but like content policy checks for the Gen AI world, which is where you can actually just move this guardrails piece out of your application and into the gateway, which is where, moving it from, having everything embedded within your program, you can actually move a lot of this stuff directly on the gateway. So the guardrail execution actually happens on the gateway. It's a lot faster, it's a lot more efficient. You don't have to worry about when things change. So just makes sense to move it here.
Yes. Okay. That makes sense. And then um, when it comes to these guardrails that you're putting into the AI gateway, um, I guess you can think of this as like also sitting over some of the other stuff like prompt management and security and like routing and stuff. Are there ways to um, are there ways to route guardrails to certain LLMs? Like let's say like I think that I've got this fine-tuned LLM that I
Mhm.
think has really good guardrails, so I only want to monitor it. But then I've got like a regular LLM that I really want to put some guardrails on and make sure that things are going somewhere or the other. Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, and this is where I think the gateway just becomes so much more powerful because you can do different sets of things. So let's try doing something like this, right? Um, so I can go back to my config and say, suppose I have two different models, and both of these models probably need different guardrails. So what I could actually do is I can say, let's create a load balance strategy because we're using two different LLMs. So I'm going to say the mode is load balanced, and then I can define targets for, so I have two targets, and the
Okay.
first target is probably my bad LLM that needs the guardrails,
Okay.
and the second target can actually just be a good LLM,
Sure.
and I'm done. So I mean, this is where I can just set it up like this,
Oh, wow.
and my requests will automatically just go through. Yeah.
That's so much simpler than having to put the LLMs like within I mean not the LLMs, the guardrails within the
Yeah.
application. Like once you get it back, like you're gonna run these guardrails, but you can actually just run these directly
Yeah.
on top of their responses in the gateway. Wow, okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Even something like this is something that I like doing quite a bit, and we do very often at Portkey now is you set up a fallback and you say the fallback uh, also runs on the 246 status code.
Okay.
So now what I've done is it says if this guardrail fails,
Yeah.
if this request with this guardrail fails, then make a request to Anthropic. So it's just this setup, and I have my orchestration with the guardrail automatically built in to the application now.
Wow. Okay. That also makes a lot of sense. What are some of like the use cases that you're seeing people use guardrails for?
We see the most simple ones end up being like make sure my JSON schema matches,
Okay.
because that's the minimum thing that will break everything within their application. Especially as people are going to agentic flows, they're like, okay, I want to generate everything as a series of tags or everything as JSON,
Hmm.
and then use that to make deductions further down the chain. So in that case, guardrail becomes really important. So JSON checks, regex checks are almost base case stable. There's a lot of content filtering going on, so make sure there's no toxicity. I don't talk about these things. My chatbot should not be used as an AI girlfriend. So all of those pieces just starts to become, I think, a thing that people care about a lot. Uh, I think these would be the most prominent ones. But then I feel that over the next 6 months, we're going to see a lot more complex guardrails put in place, stuff like, is my answer relevant to the question being asked? And this is just a function of how fast these guardrails themselves become. So if a
Mm,
guardrail takes longer than the LLM request to run, then people are still like not incentivized to do it. But over the next 3, 4 months, as guardrails themselves become faster, we'll see people just wanting to put a lot of these checks before the output comes out to the end user.
I see. Okay, so one interesting thing here is like the guardrails that are running the LLM requests. What LLMs are they using? And do we
Yeah.
have any control over that?
Yeah, so I think that's something that's been hotly debated. That should we even use LLMs as a judge or not? Um, Typically, I think people end up using a more specialized LLM to do a specific task, which is a guardrail. So, say for example, Patronus's is concise check. That's
Mm,
actually a fine-tuned LLM they've defined that runs to only accomplish one task, which is this concise or not? So we can probably say it has a better accuracy rate than my regular LLM that I'm using. But yeah, I think it's still probabilistic. You're right.
okay, and for example, with the is concise LLM, is that like something that's like built into like the Patronus's check specifically? But like if I were to
Yeah,
use like a port key created guardrail that does
yeah,
LLM as a judge, can I change
yeah.
the LLM or is it like that's
Yeah,
automatic? Oh, you can. Okay, okay, okay. So I
yeah.
can
You
take
change
my
the LLM, change the prompt, yeah, anything that you want to. So it's
okay.
basically completely your prompt that you've defined and your LLM that you're using. So you pick whichever LLM, whatever your prompt is, and make the request.
So each guardrail is basically its own like small generative AI application.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Technically,
okay.
yes.
Oh, that's okay. That's an interesting way to think about this. So one other thing that I've seen people do is
Mhm.
some people will treat LLMs not as like it doesn't require that you have an LLM like endpoint, like oh like this has to go to OpenAI or something, but it's just like this is an API call, and you kind of treat it
Mhm.
like an agent. This is an API call that takes some text input and outputs some text input. How do you guys treat LLMs internally on Portkey?
So it's essentially exactly this way, right? And I
Okay.
feel a lot of people would do this with Portkey in the middle. So you would say the agent just needs to talk to this gateway, and this gateway will, take in this input, do whatever it needs to do, and give me the output. Now, agents are a little bit more advanced because you can have multiple requests happening one after the other.
Hmm.
That's not something that Portkey does, but
Hmm.
essentially you can have an agent that talks to the gateway, which has all of these configurations set up, your guardrail set up, security governance set up, and the agent can then keep talking to the gateway like a regular API request. So that's how we even think of it, saying um, generative AI is no longer about training models, figuring out if it's working or not. It's just about making API calls and then making the best use of the outputs. So that's it. We're just making the API calls more efficient, more reliable, better in cost, and more accurate. Yeah.
Okay. That is I mean that is definitely one way to approach how generative AI is being done now. I think it's a very
Yeah.
accurate description of how generative AI applications are being built. And I think this has been a really fast kind of evolution, right? Like software, a lot of software applications are kind of built in this way, right? It's a bunch of API calls, you're kind of doing some plumbing, you're putting things together, you're getting data into one put or another. And
Yeah.
what I think and what I've seen in the industry, and I'd like to get your opinion on this as well, is just like uh, it almost seems like we've gotten to the point where we can use generative AI just like another puzzle piece in our like software development.
Yeah.
I don't know, toolbox, lifecycle, whatever.
Yeah.
What are you seeing? Is that something that you agree
Yeah.
with?
Exactly. I mean, if you even see the evolution, right? It started with next token prediction, which was the earliest version of GPT-2,
Yeah.
became better in 3. And the minute they did this chat interface where you could ask a question and it gives an answer, that was awesome in 3.5. And then came the reasoning, which just opened up a whole new space of what's possible with AI. Now with vision and audio and everything else. So it's almost like an evolution where, yes, you just treat it as a capability. I also like to think of it, and tell me if this sounds right, is you have CPUs
Yeah.
And maybe this is another form of compute where a CPU, you give it a 2 plus 2 and it gives you a output. Here
Yeah.
you're giving it another input and it's giving you an output, which is probably probabilistic today. So it's almost a new compute mechanism that application builders can use within their applications. What do you think about that?
Oh yeah, I mean that makes sense. As like an interesting way to think about this is like a new compute mechanism. I think this is something that I also see a lot discussed a lot online. Is just like the whole like um, LLMs or generative AI applications in general are kind of bound by their compute right now, and that is the
Yeah,
main way that they're being used. Right, they're kind of being used a lot of times to determine, if something fits, like the guardrails, or sometimes
yeah,
they're just used to generate text, like people's AI girlfriends, right? So
correct.
a lot of times it does seem like it is like a new tool in the compute box. Um, oh, one thing I also this just came to mind when you were talking about the chat interface is like, when you
Mhm.
talk with ChatGPT, when you're chatting with ChatGPT, it has this kind of streaming like interface where it comes in and it streams in the text to you.
Yeah.
Is that something that's possible with guardrails, or do you feel like that's something
Mhm.
that uh, you kind of have to like deal with not having the streaming interface in order to put guardrails in?
Yeah, yeah. So I think the way we built it right now is you can run asynchronous guardrails with streaming, which
Okay.
is, after the stream completes, we will just calculate the guardrail and store it and log it. But real-time streaming and then pausing the stream to really do something is still too intrusive. I
Yeah.
think we're thinking about some ways that we can do this more in real time. So the minute the LLM makes a mistake, we can pause it right there and not let the response go through. That's something that we're thinking about, that what's the best way to do it, but it's not a solved problem, I feel.
Yeah, yeah, I feel like it'd be a tough problem. Like, like you could have the LLM, it's like writing this answer to you, and then all of a sudden you
Yeah,
get this guardrail where it hits and it's like, oh, that's not right. And then what does it have to do? Does it like pause and rewrite it? Does it like pause, backspace, and like go back? Like, I don't know. Like, how does that
yeah,
work
yeah,
out? Like, that's like
exactly.
an interesting thing to think about how to do that. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think ChatGPT does it to a little bit. Like sometimes I've seen that it writes something and then so it's already given me the bad answer, but then
Okay.
after a while it'll just stop and just erase itself completely. So that's something that
Oh,
is
really?
one way to do it, but it's a very janky experience. I don't know.
Okay.
We'll have to see how it evolves.
I haven't seen ChatGPT do that, but that's honestly pretty cool that there's cases like that you can do that.
Yeah.
Um, are there any kind of like edge cases that you think are really interesting to discuss?
I think currently with guardrails, latency is the biggest edge case.
Latency.
And the second, yeah, so latency is obviously a problem because a lot of times you might want to prevent something from happening, but the only way you can do this is at the expense of extra latency, which may or may not be desirable. And the second, we talked about it, right? LLMs as a judge. So till the time we don't have good guardrails in place, it'll forever be this cat and mouse game of, or has my guardrail caught up to the latest model that's already doing a bunch of this stuff or does not do this really well. So I think how do we use LLMs as a judge and then how do we do this is obviously important. Streaming is an interesting problem for us to solve. So if anybody's looking to contribute and help us out build this in the open source gateway, uh, please do put in a PR.
Okay.